before I start, I'd like to give a special shout out to the Plus Hotel Wi-Fi, where quite a few people are staying, for blocking games on their Wi-Fi, which has made finding pictures for this talk a bit of a challenge. Woo, thank you. Yeah, before I start, No, I'm okay, thanks. So before I start, this isn't about video games curation. Neko Atsume, how many people are playing this? How many people recognize these little kitties? Woo! If you're not, you should. I just kind of want to give a little bit of a short presentation, which is about the fact that there's a secret way to get fish in this game that I don't think many people know about. And the way that you do this, you have to know about the secret fish password. So I'm going to give a quick introduction as to how to do this. So what you need to do to get the secret fish, so you pull up this menu screen here, and you want to click on the red news icon at the bottom with the big red exclamation mark, which should then take you to this handy screen, which has this little dude at the top who's got like a little notice board with a thing, and that thing that is on his notice board is actually a password. And what you want to do is click on that password, which then takes you to this screen. And in this screen, the top box, which I don't know how many people speak Japanese, but that top box is actually, I think, asking you for the password. So you want to click on the top box on there, which brings you through to this page, which on this page, if you click the words in the graphics, that then gives you secret special fish, which I don't think many people know about. But yeah, so if anybody's wondering how I'm going to segue from talking about Neko Atsume into talking about curating video games, I'm not. I just kind of wanted an excuse to bring them into the talk. So anyway, so yeah, we're going to talk today about curating video games. And when I talk about curation, just a quick note at the beginning, just to say that the sort of curation that I'm not talking about online curation, we're not talking about Steam curators. Now, don't get me wrong, I've got no problems with the sort of appropriation or the use of the term curation in regards to Steam curation. What I'm talking about is video games, and video games in physical, actual, real-life spaces, like this one that we're in now. And we're talking about events that are festivals, club nights, expos, and exhibitions. And all of these are different places that all require different approaches to curation, and they're all trying to communicate something different about games. And so the sort of work that you'll probably know me best for, although people probably might recognize more, is my work heading up Wild Rumpus. And this is a selection of some posters from some of our past events. And we've been around for 4 years now, and our work has been sort of dragging the independent video game scene, kicking and screaming, into nightclubs around the world. And Rumpus isn't a festival, it's not an awards, and it's not an exhibition. This is a club night and a party, and it's curated in that fashion, and with that sort of context in mind. And so the history, where did this come from for us? That sort of 4 years ago, sort of going back to 2011 in the UK, there weren't very many places to engage with video games in a public setting. And this was kind of the bulk of, I guess, sort of what people had, and spaces people had to go to. And I find expos just to be sometimes just such big, brutally unplayful spaces that they don't feel sympathetic to the sort of work that they showcase. They're commercially motivated spaces on the most part, and they're spaces that I never particularly felt welcomed or represented with them. And so, around about that time, we became aware of work that was happening sort of across the pond. And like, I know it's interesting when I speak to a lot of people that put on video game events and club nights and parties, that they sort of say to us like, oh, it's amazing, like Wild Rumpus really inspired us to do the work that we do. But for us, the sort of main inspiration, I think, came from who I sort of see as being the founding fathers of the new arcade movement, and that is the work of Baby Castles in New York and the work of Curating with their Gamma events in Montreal. And we saw these images coming across online, and I never had a chance to go to these events. I've been to sort of Baby Castles events since, but there were just these images at these events that had this excitement and passion and showed a side of games that I could really be excited about, and it was a side of games that I was interested in. And so we did what all great artists do. We stole their idea. And we did what they did, even though I do sort of think that you can never really steal ideas, because whatever you do and whenever you take ideas from other people, I think you tend to make it your own, and you bring your own sort of personality and your own impressions to that work. And so this is what we created, which I sometimes sympathetically refer to as the bastard hipster child of the nightclub in the arcade. And so during the 4 years that we did this work, I learned an awful lot about curating playful public spaces, and about what games do work and don't work in those settings, and in particular, sort of what sort of games do work in drunken club night spaces when most of your guests are slightly inebriated. And it was during this period that this wasn't my main job that I was doing, because as many people that work in sort of video game events know, it's not a space that you enter into because of the lucrative windfalls of cash. It's more of a sustainable event, but during this period, this is what I was doing in this side of my life, and it was really strange that I was working as a digital producer by day and by night doing these really amazing events. And I sort of became a bit unsure about the work that I was doing, and not especially because when I went to sort of events like GDC and I went to sort of events like this, that when I'd attend, I sort of had this bit of a sort of issue with myself that people would ask me if I made video games or if I wrote about video games, and I did neither of those things. But I was just like, well, we put on club nights and we put on parties, but over the years, I began to sort of realize what the work I was doing, and that was that I was working as a video game curator. And it's really interesting that, I mean, my sort of personal background is that I come from film, and I used to work in film distribution. And during that period of time, I don't think that there was anybody when I went to film festival spaces that when I was at an event, that would expect you to make films to be present at a film event. It was sort of expected within that sort of, I guess, that medium in those events, that there was room in those spaces for people that undertook cultural work, that were the film festival programmers or people that undertook other things. And when I started to embrace that term and I started to call myself a video game curator and actually went to GDC and gave a talk and declared myself a video game curator, a funny thing happened, which was that I kind of then actually became a proper curator with a big capital C. And this is kind of a little bit more what I want to talk to you guys about today, is that as of January this year, I became a curator of digital design for the V&A Museum in London. And I don't know how many people here are familiar with the V&A? A few people, well, that's good. So, okay, the V&A, it's a London-based museum, and it's one of the world's largest, and it was one of the world's first museums that's dedicated to design. And it's one of the most visited in the world as well, with around sort of 3 million visits in a year. And it's a very fancy space, as we can see from these pictures. So we went from here to here. From here. And I have to apologize to those two guys in that photograph. It's not a very flattering picture of them, but thanks for their sacrifice. So yeah, from here to here. But I'm kind of doing the V&A a little bit of a disservice here, because it is a very forward-thinking sort of museum about digital design, about design. And it is one that deals with sort of contemporary concepts and contemporary discussions about design. And here's a couple of their exhibitions that they've undertaken recently. And this is one which was called David Bowie Is, which was a phenomenally successful exhibition about the work of David Bowie. And it's still traveling the world today. I think it's in France or Paris at the moment, and then moving on to Melbourne. And the current exhibition, which is a phenomenally successful revival of Savage Beauty, which is an exhibition about the work of Alexander McQueen. And it's a really, really beautiful exhibition, and a really sort of, I hate to use the word sort of immersive space, but it's set design in this event, in this exhibition, is absolutely stunning. But me personally, I never harbored any aspirations to become a museum curator. I never harbored any aspirations to work in a space like this. I've always kind of just followed a compass point of things that I was interested in. And what I was interested in was video games. And so I'm working there as digital design curator, and it's not a coincidence that I'm somebody who is very passionate about video games, and the reason why I'm currently in this role, and that's because the V&A wants to begin to embrace video games. And they want to acknowledge this as a field of design that deserves to be collected and preserved, and also to be exhibited and discussed. So kind of on the whole, I care a little bit less about what it means for me to get a job at the V&A, even though it's a heck of a lot easier to explain to your mum that you work as a curator in an exhibition or in like a fancy museum space than it does to sort of say, well, I put on video game parties and club nights, but it's a little bit more sort of a respectable job title. But yeah, so I care less about what it means for me to work at the V&A than it does to just have somebody than what it means for video games, for somebody like myself to be working in there. And not just somebody that comes from video games on a whole, but somebody that comes from sort of a more niche area within video games itself, that this is where I come from, this is my life, this is the work I've been undertaking. But yeah, and obviously there's a difference between sort of what it means to curate within a Wild Rumpus setting and what it means to curate within a major museum, because when I'm curating for the Wild Rumpuses, we're thinking what games fit in physical settings and in public settings, what games work in those spaces. But that's not the only conversation about game design that we want to have. So I'm having to now deal with a whole new challenge, which is completely new to me, which is thinking, okay, well, say a game like Eve, how on earth do you communicate that in a public setting? You can't just plonk Eve down as a game and ask people to come up and play it and expect them to understand the sheer sort of depth and brevity of a work like that. And so it's a really amazing sort of challenge to be having to deal with. But yeah, the V&A is not the first museum to have sort of embraced video games previously. Now, I have to apologize, I think, to some of these exhibitions that I've put up on the slide, on the showcase here, because these video game exhibitions have done an amazing job sort of going back sort of 10 years of being the first exhibitions that really brought the concept of sort of bringing video games into these major institutional art spaces. But I don't know if anyone else in the room had a slight issue with some of the sort of stuff that I'm seeing up here, that I can't engage with, I guess, sort of this concept of video games, of having sort of Pac-Man and Super Mario Brothers being the only cultural ambassadors for video games in these spaces. I mean, just this title, this cover of this book, The Art of Video Games, that's just so depressing to me. But again, I don't want to be too much of a snob, because there is an incredible value in games like this, and we should be talking about Pac-Man, and we should be talking about this work, and this is still the art of video games. But I just feel that the conversation needs to move on a bit. We need to not be talking about pixels. We need to not only be talking about having these people and Space Invaders be the only sort of cultural ambassadors for ourselves in those sort of spaces. And of course, there's other sort of spaces as well that have taken on that work. And so MoMA here on the left did sort of have run exhibitions before which embraced video games. But the way that they did it under the heading of interaction design, and they said video games are important because they're important to interaction design. And to that, I kind of just think, well, what the heck is wrong with video game design in itself? That is a design field, and as a design museum, you should be engaging with that in a field on its own. And on the right here is an image from the Indie Game Revolution, which, in my opinion, is probably one of the most progressive sort of exhibitions that's been had in a major institution. And it's an exhibition that's about, obviously, sort of indie games. And I think whilst I find sort of the concept a little bit clunky, this sort of arbitrary sort of distinction between sort of games and independent games, but it's incredibly revolutionary to have something like that. But what I want to see, and I'm still kind of yet to see whether this is something that I can achieve in a space like the V&A, is that I want to see a bridging of these sorts of ways that large institutions engage with video games and the way that we know and love them, and the sort of conversations that we have at events like this, and the sort of things that we really love about video games, and the depth. I want to hear about the contemporary. I want to hear about the political. I want to hear about the cultural and the personal and the niche and the nuances. And I want to talk about the weird dark alleyways. And as I said, Pac-Man and Mario should not be the only ambassadors in cultural institutions talking about video games. But away from sort of larger exhibition spaces, that there have been great exhibitions that have taken place in smaller spaces, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, and I feel especially bad for doing that, having watched Rami Ismail's talk from GDC this year, but this was an exhibition that Baby Castles put on. I don't know, I think it was either last year or the year before, in their new sort of permanent exhibition space, and it was an exhibition that was dealing with the lived Muslim experience in video games. And we have on the right here an example of the code that Ramzi Nasir designed, which is a code that is purely in Arabic. And they exhibited this with a game of Pong running in the background. And it's just an amazing exhibition for you to think about the fact that it deals with some political sort of conversations and incredibly personal conversations within video games today. And I am a complete fangirl. How many people know about Femicom and the work of Rachel Simone-Wheel? Good, there's a few hands going up. They should all be going up, because I'm a complete fangirl for Rachel's work and what she undertakes. And she is somebody who, Femicom is sort of like a fan, I say fan, but it's sort of her own museum or collecting that she started undertaking, which is collecting sort of hyper-feminine and girly games, because it's a side of video game history that isn't often collected and isn't often remembered or talked about. And it's important because, like, I think when she started undertaking this work, she realized that when you look online and you look sort of around at how many people were engaging with sort of older arcades and older games that were from that feminine side of games, that there was no real engagement with it that wasn't dismissive. It was very very much talking about sort of, oh, it's a game about shopping and relationships, it's obviously not of value. And then equally from the other side, from sort of, I guess, sort of more feminist spaces, that the conversations were very like, oh, well, it's pink, and girls don't like pink, so there was nobody that was really collecting that work. And when you think about the sort of retro histories that we keep telling ourselves about video games, that we need to expand that, we need to widen that, we need to be more representative and preserve some of this work that's incredibly important. So that's why I really love the work that she does. And I've just realized the time for this. I think I'm going to get through this at an astonishingly quick pace that I wasn't expecting. But yeah, so I'm putting this up with a disclaimer. This isn't what the V&A is collecting necessarily, but it's just an example of an artifact that I think when museums and major exhibition spaces begin to collect, but they're collecting for video games, and they're collecting items that represent the side of video games, and all those sort of things that I mentioned on that side before about the political and the cultural and the contemporary. I really hope that we were able to think differently about what sort of objects we should be collecting and what sort of objects we should be exhibiting and preserving that speak about the culture and the community that we know about. And this t-shirt is just such a fantastic object that sort of represents so much of that, and it says so much more to me about sort of contemporary video games than collecting sort of Pac-Man or Mario does. But so I'm really bagging on those games today, but I don't mean to. But yeah. And so for me, I'm kind of going to end this talk on a slide which has a list of names, which are some of the people that I could quickly remember in my hotel room while I was jotting down different people who work in this space, because I think that there's sometimes a lack of conversations that we have about events and exhibitions and the people that undertake that work, and it's incredibly important work. And those people behind that work don't even get talked about. It's often sort of, because they're so often sort of championing the work of other people. So at the end of this talk, when you give me that sort of politely awkward clap at the end of it, I'm going to accept that this isn't just a clap for myself, that it's a clap for every single person whose name on this board and every single person that I've forgotten about to type up there, I know I've probably forgotten a ton, because they all do absolutely amazing work, and it's not often talked about. And we should be talking about people that curate video games, be that in a festival space, be that in exhibition spaces, be that in small galleries or large galleries and large museums, be that sort of expositions and festivals. But it's amazing work, and I think we should talk about it more, because it's important to present and protect and preserve the video games that we know and love. Thank you.
All right, this time I think we do have a couple of minutes for questions in case there's anyone. You have to come up here to the stage if you want to ask a question.
Don't all rush at once.
Nobody? Yes.
So what have you found the difference between curating for clubs and curating for a museum?
It's a big difference that when we're curating for, so the way that we work with Wild Rumpuses and the way that we curate is actually a team of us, and there's two of them in the audience there. Hi. But so the way that we do curate Wild Rumpuses, that it's an event that we know that happens in the evenings, it happens in a space where people are quite drunk, and so the sort of games that we bring into that space are the sort of games that we know are going to work within that sort of public setting, that people can play together. They're normally short games or quick games or games that are quite easy to engage with, and games of spectacle and performance. But when you're talking in a museum space, you can't be that selective about the sort of games that you want to exhibit. You instead have to think, okay, there's games that we want to and we should be representing in this space that perhaps aren't necessarily best showcased as the game themselves. And so it's a really big challenge, because you kind of want to identify, okay, what do you want to talk about, and then thinking about how can you show that, because as I said before, like putting Eve in a museum, it's an incredibly important game, but you can't just put Eve within a museum space and have it speak for itself. But it's a journey that I'm on at the moment, and I feel as though there's so much to do that I feel like there's a certain sense of vertigo, because it's just like, oh my God, where do you even start? Because there's so many games. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there another question? Yes, come up here. Oh, sorry. Oh, you go first. You go second. Come here.
Hello.
Hi, Laura.
I was wondering. Oh, sorry. Yeah, how you've seen it changed over the years you've been involved with it, and have you seen, like, in the beginning it being largely just very digital games, here's a controller, and that moving more towards installation stuff, or how that changes and how people have reacted to now that people creating stuff have gone to these events, has that influenced them? And maybe if you see it going in any directions in the future, because I was really interested with the V&A, you talked about like showing the t-shirt and stuff, which was really interesting. So
do you mean how it's evolved with the Rumpus sort of?
Yeah, and like how you've seen it evolve and like.
It's sort of fluctuated. That I think I don't know. It's sort of been ups and downs. That it sort of changes with each event. That I think at the beginning we definitely felt that there was less sort of spaces that were really showcasing sort of local multiplayer games. And I think because of the rise of events like us during that period of time, that it really impacted. I guess sort of, or we hope that we sort of impacted. I guess in some way the sort of games that were being created, and people I guess sort of saw that there were spaces to be able to make games that didn't have to be like, right, okay, how am I going to put this in Steam? You can think about designing for a different platform and giving them a different canvas to work with and a different sort of space to sort of think about. But I think there was sort of a period where there was definitely more installation games, but I think the problem with that sort of work, is probably a lot of people that create that work know, is that exactly because you can't put that stuff on the Steam store means that it's not something that's financially viable necessarily or sustainable to undertake. And so we'd love to find ways that we can actually be able to support the people that actually do create that work. But I don't know, I think it's fluctuated a little bit. There definitely has been a rise in local multiplayer games, but then also I don't know how much that's to do with the events platforming them and making them more visible. But yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask if you maybe have some practical tips about how to decide on what games to choose. I mean, there's like millions of games and so many platforms, and you can browse just like lists of games for weeks and like still not know which like small selection you're gonna make.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, for Rumpus, it's a lot easier, though. We do have a focus on contemporary stuff, and we tend not to repeat games that we've showcased. And as I said before, the sort of games that we're looking for are games that work in a public setting. So they are those sort of local multiplayer games, or they'll be games of sort of spectacle and performance. And for that, then we just sort of have an awareness from what games have been showcased at other events and what games we're personally interested in. But when it comes to the V&A side of things, I have no idea, because I'm just completely, as I said, I just feel vertigo, because there's so much more still to be said about video games in those spaces that I think I have to accept, and most spaces have to accept, that in those sort of spaces, one exhibition and one event is not going to say it all. And just sort of for me, it's like, okay, well, what is the most important conversation we could perhaps have now? And what am I personally interested in? And what do I feel is really perhaps sort of the most relevant thing to be talking about with games now? But that's still resulting in lists of hundreds and hundreds of games. But if you know your space and you know your environment, then that sort of at least gets you sort of halfway. And then knowing sort of the stuff that you're sort of interested in as well.
I was wondering about how you exhibit the pieces in a museum space, because I find it incredibly difficult to walk through an exhibition of media art that already takes a lot of time to consume, and then video games, you can't even consume the game before you engage with it, because you have to learn the mechanics. And any sense in that the photos you showed of the Victoria and Albert Museum, they're like completely empty, and that scares me as an image of having to curate that and having like a few people go there and then they're being reluctant to even engage with the game and looking at it and then think, oh yeah, games.
Yeah, there's a whole conversation about sort of games literacy and making games sort of accessible within those spaces, which I didn't go into in this. But when it comes to sort of the V&A, I think, and this is kind of why I've gone back to this slide, and I think what we've sort of seen with a lot of past exhibitions is this trend to only exhibit or only see the game as in itself as an artifact or an object that can be exhibited. And so sort of Games Masters exhibition that's up in Scotland at the moment, sort of it's promoted as having over 100 playable games. And it feels to me like if you were going to put on an exhibition about feature films, you wouldn't have a room with 100 feature films all blaring and shouting out at once, because you can't engage with that work in that way. And so it's trying to think, okay, well, if you're not showing the game then, and that's kind of, I think, what the process is for somewhere where you're trying to talk about a video game as a medium of design, how do you put it into a space like the V&A? And I think it's not like what we do with Wild Rumpuses, where we necessarily have playable games, that you have to find other artifacts. And that's why I have to start to have more more conversations with developers, and I want more developers to come and reach out and talk to me about their design process and talk to me about their prototypes and their concept art and their concept music, so that we can begin to find, okay, that you don't want a room of 1,000 things screaming for attention, that you want to be able to guide people. And I think sometimes there's a misconception that because video games are an interactive medium, that the only way to engage with them is through being interactive. But that works in some places and in some incidences, but not in all. Like, I've seen some really sad exhibitions of games like Shadow of the Colossus or Ico, and it's just like, wow, you can't just plonk that game into the middle of a museum space and expect somebody to appreciate it. And so, yeah, it's a complete challenge thinking how we do that, but I don't think it's about putting the games necessarily, or all the games and the completed games into the space. It's how you distill those and how you explain those stories. Like, in the same way that for architecture, you can't put a building into a museum, so you find another way of talking about it.
First of all, thank you very much for actually doing the work, because I think archival of our stuff, like, you know, if we consider ourselves as a cultural institution, we are really bad at archiving what we do. So first of all, thank you for doing that. And I was just wondering if you have ever had any idea of archiving what you do. Obviously, because then to help along the next sort of generation. But also, I'm kind of curious with the, like, as a video game developer, I'm really curious about the challenges that you have to go through, the logistical challenges, things like that. And if there's anything that I can do as a developer to help you out, to help you as a curator, essentially, and yeah, those kind of things.
Yeah, it's a really big conversation, and again, I didn't go into sort of the archival and preservation sort of side of things on this talk, because I feel that that's sort of a really big learning process for me in the V&A at the moment, is that part of curation is about preserving and archiving this work for future generations, and it's incredibly hard as somebody who has been traveling a lot recently and got rid of all her belongings and is a bit of an anti-hoarder to suddenly be like, right, okay, your job now is pretty much just hoarding, just get everything. But there's a lot of people that are undertaking that work. There's a big undertaking to sort of like the sort of Internet Archive and different people that are preserving sort of, and whether you use emulators to use work, and is it just the game itself that you want to preserve? Like, again, sort of, if you take an MMO, you can't just necessarily preserve the game and expect to turn it on. Even if you manage to preserve that and all the dependent technologies that you need to be able to present that, what does turning that game on in 100 years say to anybody if there's nobody in it and nobody playing it? So there's a lot of people that are taking that work on, but I think the only way to really approach that challenge is to kind of begin to identify and have conversations about what possible sort of things, be they digital or physical, exist that might be worth preserving. And I think developers are some of the only people that know the key design stories of their work, and they know sort of, okay, well, this was important. This email conversation was a really key moment in the development of this game. And so knowing that work and just talking, engaging with curators, I think is important. And through that, instead of trying to look at all of games and think about how you can preserve everything, you instead try and focus on one or two examples and one or two things, and through that sort of begin to learn, okay, well, what if we're preserving this sort of specific prototype, what dependent technologies do we need to have to remember and preserve that prototype, and to be able to, I guess, sort of what hardware is then dependent on that work to be able to showcase that in future. But I think it's such an all-encompassing question. It's not an area that I've got personal expertise in, and it's a learning process for me, but there's a lot of people that are sort of having those conversations and looking at how you do it, and it's normally the first question I get asked when I talk about curating games. It's like, how are you preserving anything? It's impossible. But yeah, I think the best thing that people can do to help is just talk to people and just try and, yeah, have an awareness about what you know is important from your work, and just have those conversations with people.
Anyone else? I had a question, actually. So you're also trying with your work to engage people who are outside of the game scene into the work. Do you have like any good stories of like how you could, like somebody came to one of the events and totally changed their mind about video games?
One of the stories that I do remember was that when I was working at Penguin, which was the last sort of full-time job I had before this one, and Penguin, the book publishers in the UK, and one of the women, it was sort of, again, sort of very female-dominated industry, and one of the women sort of came up to me, and again, when I worked at Penguin, it was a sort of space that I was in the complete minority of people that played video games or had any conversations about that, but I just remember there was a woman that came up to me, and it was shortly after the party that we did, which was on a boat. It was called MS Stubnitz, which was this converted ex-Cold War fishing vessel. And the next day when I came into the office, she came up to me and she was like, oh my God, you were at that event last night. And I think, as much as I hate to admit it, I think she partly recognized me because it was probably one of the fewer women that were in attendance at that event. But I sort of said to her afterwards, I was like, oh my God, what game did you play? And she's like, I had an amazing time. I really loved it. It's amazing. I didn't know that there was all this stuff about video games to learn about. And I was like, great, what did you enjoy? What did you play? And she said, oh, I didn't play anything. And it was just like, right. But I don't count that as a complete failure because it's just sort of, I'm really bad and I hate playing games in public spaces. So for me, it just sort of reinforces the fact that when we're curating Rumpus and when we're thinking about other spaces, it's thinking not just about the interaction with that game, but it's thinking about the spectacle and the performance of people that are coming and watching other people play. And I think that especially like with things like Twitch have shown, it's like people like watching people play games. But yeah, that's the one I always remember.
Any other question from the audience? All right, thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you.